Our world is a scary place. Anyone who has ever used deviant knows that firsthand. Between animals like the Shrike and that video of the black venom sludge stuff you all forgot about, it's hard to believe that the existence of something like Bigfoot is completely out of the question. And with all the horror stories about skinwalkers and such, the concept of what is and isn't real begins to blur a little bit. And in times like that, it's nice to hear a story or two that aren't just scary, but you also know are 100% fake. Enter r/nosleep, a subreddit for people to write and share their own fictional horror stories. It's basically creepypasta, except actually good. And so, on this day of spooks and scares, I thought, what better of a way to celebrate than to read some of these stories to you? Now, a brief disclaimer before we start. The first story contains light elements of body horror, and the last story contains heavy body horror. So if you're squeamish or just don't like body horror, I'd recommend clicking off of this video. But for those of you who have stayed, enjoy the stories, and happy Halloween! Story 1. There's a reason I've never worn false eyelashes. Allie didn't like Tamara. I don't know why. I mean, it's not like Tamara ever bothered her, or anyone. Tamara was the classic quiet loner kid, complete with black fishnets, fingerless gloves, and choppy bright blue and black hair. She was the only alternative kid at school, so she wasn't exactly swimming in friends. She was really good at makeup. It was her passion. Rumor had it her mom bought her all kinds of super classy high-end makeup to use. She'd come to school with a face like out of a fashion magazine. And she always had these long, false eyelashes. Other girls in school tried to wear them too, but they could never get them to stick. And the edges would be coming off their eyelid. Or they'd try to put their eyeliner over them and totally mess it up. Not Tamara, though. Hers looked flawless. Like they were her natural eyelashes, except, of course, that they were freakishly long. I think maybe Allie didn't like her because she was too good at makeup. Allie strove to be the pretty, preppy blonde. Like, that whole high school stereotype was her jam. It's all she wanted. It was important to her the way nothing else was. And she did a pretty good job being that girl. Except that her makeup was just bad. She just couldn't seem to figure it out. Her eyeliner was always crooked. Her foundation was always the wrong shade. The other popular girls would snipe at her. Looking back, I think she was so insecure about it that it just infuriated her that Tamara, who didn't even care about being popular or liked, was good at it and not her. I don't know. It's all speculation at this point. It's been years since it happened, and it's not like I've talked about it with either of them since. The day it happened, Allie was ragging on Tamara again. She did that a lot. Went out of her way to call Tamara weird or a freak or ugly. I didn't like it, to be honest. I should have told her to knock it off, but Allie was my best friend, and I didn't want to upset her, and I was a coward. I was a million things but a good person. Then again, that's kind of what high school is like, isn't it? A bunch of sneering little assholes who haven't learned human decency yet. So Allie was making fun of Tamara, like always. And just before the bell rang for first period, she sneered, "Those falsies are so trash. You look like you stuck spider legs on your eye. But I bet you like that, don't you, you freak?" Tamara didn't say anything. She never said anything. But she did watch as Allie and I marched off to first period. She watched in a way that made me uneasy. There wasn't anything unusual about that school day. It was a Friday, and Allie and I had planned a sleepover like we often did. We met up after school, and by that time, I'd just about forgotten Allie's snipe at Tamara that morning. It was easy to forget since it happened so often. It was just a normal part of our day at that point. About halfway on our walk to Allie's house, I felt the hairs prickling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I stopped in the middle of our conversation. Allie was talking about one of the books we were reading for English class, Pride and Prejudice, I think, and turned around, half expecting to see nobody there. But there was someone. Tamara. Allie turned to look at what I'd seen, and immediately her face twisted in annoyance. Oh, is she seriously following us? Maybe she's just walking home too, I said. As if she never walks this way. I would have noticed her. Something else struck me as strange about the situation. Tamara had stopped the moment we had. She was just standing there then, watching us. Let's just keep walking, I said, and that might have been the end of it. Except that Allie could never let anything go, especially when it came to Tamara. Hey, bitch! What the fuck are you looking at? She shouted. Tamara didn't say anything. What, you decided you wanted to follow us home? Think if you beg us, maybe we'll be friends with you? You're so pathetic. Tamara still didn't say anything, but she started walking towards us. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Oh my god, she's actually coming over here, laughed Allie, but there was an edge to her voice. We should go, I said, with the kind of clarity that comes right before a catastrophe, when you can see the train coming and you know you need to get off the tracks. Now, I want to see what she does. Tamara stopped a few feet from us. What? Why me? She asked calmly. It suddenly occurred to me that I'd never actually spoken to her. And she'd never spoken to me. To either of us. Why, you? Allie laughed. Why? Do you think you're special or something? I am special, she said, quietly. Oh, brother, did your mommy tell you that? You're gonna go home and tell her that the big girls are all being mean to you? Allie affected a crybaby power, which I only noticed out of my peripheral vision. I couldn't stop looking at Tamara. I couldn't stop my instincts that was screaming that I needed to get away from her. You're not answering my question. Why me? Suddenly, Allie's playful demeanor dropped, and I could practically feel her. Who the fuck are you to demand anything from me? Who do you think you are? Not who. What? What? Repeated Allie. That's when Tamara's eyes started to move. At first I thought she was just rolling them weirdly to freak us out, but then they started bulging out of her eye sockets and sort of wriggling around, like they were trying to wriggle out. And then they did. Wriggle out. That is. 2 pairs of eyes plopped right out onto the pavement. Except they weren't just eyes. They had legs. Like tons of long spider legs, so they could scurry around on the ground. They looked a lot like the false eyelashes Tamara wore every day. At the back of each eyeball was a tail. They looked like a scorpion tail, only they appeared to be made of bone. White bone covered in red gunk. We stared down at the eyeballs. Then I looked back up at Tamara. Her eye sockets were empty and bleeding. Red rivulets running down her pale skin. She was opening her mouth, slowly. And I saw something wriggling inside. Something that had a lot of legs. Allie screamed in pain and clenched my arm until it bruised. I looked down and saw one of the eyeballs was on her shoe, and its bony tail had stabbed into her ankle. I swore and kicked it off, sending it flying into some bushes. The other eyeball was scurrying towards me. I yanked Allie around and let her hold on to me while we fled. We ran all the way home. Allie was sobbing, "What the fuck? What the fuck?" next to me. When we got in her front door, Allie practically collapsed, screaming about her leg. I looked and saw that the cut from the eyeball thing had gone really deep. Her pant leg was soaked in blood and she just wouldn't stop screaming. Her mom was home and saw what had happened. She rushed us both to the hospital, begging me to try and keep Allie calm in the back seat. It was the longest car ride of my life, despite the fact that the hospital was only 5 minutes away. Allie ended up needing stitches. The doctor said that whatever she tripped on, that was the story she gave in a moment of panic after they asked that she tripped and hit it on something on the way down, had sliced her ankle clean to the bone. There was a talk of nerve damage. I didn't know that was even possible. By the time they were ready to send her home, Allie was pale and shaking, totally silent. She stayed pretty quiet for days after that. I stayed by her side, waiting for her to snap out of it, but she didn't. Not really. A few days later, she went to the hospital due to a fever and redness around the cut. Turns out it had gotten infected, which required a pretty intense hospital stay and a lot of antibiotics. I stayed with her as often as I could. My parents even let me miss school for a couple days so I could stay by her side. By the time she was out of hospital for good, Allie was a different person. She was quiet and jumpy. She was always looking over her shoulder. She wasn't as confident, or at least she didn't act as confident as she once did. I tried talking to her about it. I tried talking to her about what happened, but she completely shut me down. She wanted to pretend it never happened. She never bothered Tamara again. Never so much as looked at her. Tamara didn't bother us either. She remained quiet and alone, like she always was. It's been years since then. I'm still friends with Allie. She recovered, I guess, from what happened, but she's not the same person. I never heard her say a bad thing about or to anyone else, so I guess the change isn't all bad. But I know she still has nightmares, and sometimes I still have to talk her down from panic attacks. As for Tamara, she went on to become a big makeup artist on YouTube. No, I won't tell you which one. I watch her videos every once in a while. Sometimes I see one of her eyes move just so, and I wonder if anyone else ever noticed that they don't seem to want to stay in her head. Story 2. People on this plane keep dying, and we aren't allowed to look out through the windows. Flying is a major part of my job. Each week for the past 20 years, I've traveled from city to city on various business meetings. During that time, I've flown enough to join the Million Mile Club. I love it, but there are aspects of flying even I can't handle. Crying babies, limited leg space, people listening to music too loud, the list goes on. Luckily, I've developed the perfect system throughout the years. It includes a neck pillow, a sleeping pill, closed shades, and earbuds. Unfortunately, during my last flight, the survival kit had gone missing during check-in. Without it, I was doomed to suffer through a long, sleepless flight. Of course, I was also seated behind someone who wouldn't stop crying. It wasn't even an infant, as I had expected, but a grown-ass woman. She sat with her face pointed towards the window and sobbed loudly. At first, I assumed she was afraid of flying, but if that were the case, surely she wouldn't be transfixed with the outside world. The thought of her being sad crossed my mind as well, but it didn't sound like it. She just seemed broken. Before long, her whining had garnered the attention of the staff. A stewardess walked over with a concerned look on her face and gently tried to start conversation with her. "Ma'am, are you alright?" The woman didn't respond. She just kept staring outside, crying non-stop. The stewardess gently shook her, yet she didn't seem to react. By then, people were getting worried. Whispers filled the cabin, people asking if she was on drugs or if she suffered a mental breakdown. I wasn't as much annoyed as I was worried, but something about the situation seemed oddly eerie. I considered opening my blinds to see what she was staring at outside, but before I got a chance, I heard another person crying a few rows behind me. I turned around to see a man sobbing loudly. He, too, stared out the window. His eyes were unblinking and didn't seem to produce a single tear. In fact, his entire face was rid of all emotion. He just sat there, crying without moving his mouth. "Sir?" one of the neighboring passengers asked as they leaned in to help him. No sooner had he peeked outside the same window as the man, before his eyes went blank, and he started sobbing with him. Then a fourth joined in, and a fifth. By the time we realized what was happening, half the plane had broken into an unbreakable rhythm of crying. "It's the windows! Close the damn shades!" one of the passengers called out. In a haste, we did as instructed. First, we made sure none of the still sane people got the chance to look out the window. Then, we proceeded to close the blinds for the crying people, each of us careful not to look outside in the process. As soon as we blocked their view of the sky, they instantly fell silent. One by one, their sobs stopped, and the plane fell into uncontrollable silence. I let out a sigh of relief, but the small victory was quickly squashed by a panicked gasp. "They're not breathing," the stewardess called out. She was right. Each of the previously sobbing passengers had died in their seats. Without a view of the sky, their bodies had simply shut down. In the span of just a few minutes, half of the plane had succumbed to an unknown curse. We attempted to resuscitate a few of them to no avail. In the end, we just sat in silence, all of us in shock at what had just happened. In the meantime, the stewardesses were trying to contact the pilots. They weren't responding, and we all knew what it meant. We'd lost them. After a few agonizing minutes of doubt, the stewardess used their emergency code to open the cockpit. On the inside, we found the pilots crying unresponsively. We brought blankets inside to quickly cover up the windows and remove the dead pilots. From there, ground control gave us instructions and aided us in landing the plane safely. It was rough, but we managed to get to the airport alive. Once there, we were met by a team in hazmat suits. Despite our explanation, they couldn't rule out a possible infection. As we expected, even after an overabundance of tests, nothing was found. To this day, I don't know what happened aboard our flight, nor do I care to find out what those poor souls saw outside the window. What I can tell you, with absolute certainty, is I am never setting foot inside a plane again. Story 3. Just a little hole. Before you call me stupid, I want you to think about your skin. It's not rare to find little marks or blemishes that you don't remember receiving. Nothing major, maybe a paper-cut-sized mark on your arm or a bruise on your leg. Stuff no one thinks about. It just happens. So I wasn't concerned when I saw the blood under my fingernails. Anything could have caused a little scab to form on my arm, and it didn't hurt when I had carelessly scratched it off. The only reason I noticed it at all was because it wouldn't stop bleeding and I didn't want to stain my shirt. So after almost half an hour of dabbing the cut with a tissue and noticing no decline in the volume of blood bleeding out, I got a Band-Aid from the first aid kit buried under my sink and stuck it on, then continued to live my life. When I woke up the next morning, I found that the Band-Aid had almost soaked through and, yeah, that freaked me out, but what was I supposed to do? Go to the doctor and tell him about the tiny scrape on my arm? So I used a thicker Band-Aid the second time, and it took hours for the blood to soak through that one. I cleaned it with alcohol and a cotton swab and covered it again. It really had no effect on me. It was just a little cut on my arm, and I hardly even thought about it after the first day. I became accustomed to switching out the Band-Aids at morning, noon, and night. I stopped cleaning it, but cleaning it didn't seem to be helping anyway. Eventually, it just became part of my routine, and whenever I left the house, I always made sure I had a Band-Aid in my pocket. The few times someone had asked about it, I told them it was just a tiny cut on my arm, and I didn't remember how I'd gotten it. And they'd understood, because who hadn't experienced that? I think the problem really boils down to routine. I took the Band-Aid off and slapped a new one on quick before anything leaked out. I stopped really looking at it, and when the bleeding started to let up after a few weeks, I was relieved. One day, when I was at work, I was interrupted halfway through switching the Band-Aid out by one of my coworkers, a man named Mark. "Jesus Christ," he said. "What is that?" Mark and I were coworkers, friendly, but not friends. "Oh, it's just a little cut. I don't even know how I got it," I said casually. "I don't know what that is," he said, "but it is not a little cut." The thing was on the back of my arm, a place where it wasn't very accessible to my eyes without the help of a mirror, but the look on Mark's face made my other hand unconsciously feel at the place that was usually covered by a Band-Aid. While I expected to feel a rough and peeling scab, I felt nothing. The skin was smooth and stretched tight, right up to the hard ridge, and then my fingers sank into a space in my arm. I felt thin, dry membranes break underneath the light pressure as they sunk deeper, but I felt no pain. Mark gagged watching me, then started sniffing the air like a lunatic. "Oh God, that's sick," he said. "I was wondering what that smell was. You need a doctor." I didn't respond. The cavern in my arm had left me speechless. I excused myself and headed for the restroom. There, I used the mirror to get a better look. It wasn't really that bad. The skin was fine around it, maybe a little pale, but otherwise fine. The hole itself was small. Inside the flesh was black, but there wasn't any blood. A faint, rancid smell emanated from it. I replaced the bandage and went back to work. It was just a little hole. Mark was overreacting. In the weeks that followed, it began to get a little bigger, and a little deeper, but my arm still felt fine. It didn't even hurt when I stuck my finger inside of it, but the smell was becoming a problem. I could see the people around me scrunching up their faces and wondering where the stench was coming from. At first, few realized it was me. I was always very clean-looking, but eventually its strength made the source easier to pinpoint. Someone, probably Mark, had complained about it to my boss, who called me into his office and told me to sort it out. So I started covering up the stench with different substances. I tried using a cotton swab drenched in alcohol, but it wasn't completely effective. Once before a meeting at which I knew I would be in close proximity to others for an extended period of time, I resorted to using a small piece of lemon. But even that didn't seem to do the trick, and I was reprimanded a second time. But in my desperation the next morning, I actually found a convenient solution. I filled it with toothpaste. The label said that baking soda was the main ingredient in the Arm & Hammer kind that I used, and I think that's why it works so well at absorbing the odor. So every morning, as I got ready for work, I would squeeze the toothpaste into the opening until it was flush with my arm, and I covered it. There were no more complaints about the smell at work. The solution, however, was quickly becoming expensive. It seemed like every day the hole in my arm was absorbing more and more, and once I started going through over a tube a week, I knew it was unsustainable. So I finally decided to see a doctor. I live in a small town, and the doctor I've had since I was a kid is an unreliable guy at best and a minor addict at worst. Greatly assisting the spread of the opioid epidemic in his own small corner of the rural Midwest, I made an appointment anyway, because at this point I knew I might have a problem. I'm not delusional. That morning, I didn't fill the hole in my arm with any toothpaste, so it would be easier for him to see inside. The smell was terrible, and it made the drive there very unpleasant. When I entered the waiting room and saw the lady at the desk immediately make a face and look at me up and down, I knew I had made the right choice in coming to the doctor. If the smell had crossed the room that fast, who knows the problems it might cause for me day to day. She smiled and handed me the sign-in sheet. Maybe it wasn't that bad. I was probably just psyching myself out. Everyone in town knew about the wait times in Dr. Murphy's office. They were so legendary that people had taken to bringing thick novels and discreetly leaving them on waiting room tables as if they'd finished them. It was a very Midwestern way to complain. I was there barely a minute before being called back. The lady at the desk took my vitals with a tight smile and sent me to the exam room, where I was promptly met by Dr. Murphy. "What seems to be the problem today?" he asked, but his eyes had already trailed to the gauze around my arm. "This sounds silly," I told him, "but I had a little cut on my arm. I don't even know where I got it. But now I think it's infected. When I started to remove the wrap, the smell got impossibly worse." "Actually," I acknowledged, "I'm pretty sure it's infected." Dr. Murphy's face twisted, repulsed by the thing on my arm. It was very unprofessional. He looked at it, then at me. "Son, are you feeling okay?" he asked. The man was despicable, and I didn't appreciate being patronized. "I'm feeling fine," I said. Even if the hole in my arm was deep, its diameter was barely larger than my fist. Okay, the man said. "Let's take a look." The way he moved towards me was hesitant. His disgust was clearly evident in his posture. He was a doctor, for God's sake. Was he really incapable of handling such a small injury? It probably had something to do with the fact that he couldn't just throw a prescription at me and send me on my way. "Lay it up here," he said, gesturing to the arm of the examination chair. And when I did, he started to pick at my arm with his sharp little tools. I felt a tugging, tearing sensation, like peeling back a roll of packing tape. Dr. Murphy made a noise in his throat, and I glanced at my upper arm. He had peeled back the skin, the perfectly healthy skin. The skin of my upper arm was now dangling from his instruments like used tissue paper. There was a sickly, minty smell, and I saw groups of dark-colored paste dripping onto the floor between us. I caught it in my hand and tried to rub it back into my arm. That stuff was expensive. "What did you do?" I demanded, leaping from the chair. Dr. Murphy was pale and speechless, watched me with horrified eyes. "Calm down," he pleaded. But how could I be calm when I could look down into see into the ligaments of my arm, the bunches of yellow fat and networks of capillaries, right down into the gleaming white bone. "Get away from me!" I shouted, grabbing my gauze and recovering the area. He was panicking now. You need to get to the hospital," he said. "I'm going to call an ambulance." "No way," I interrupted. "I'm not going to sit here and let you take off the rest of my skin." I barged out of the examination room, and he called after me, but I was already out the door. The drive home was even worse than the trip there. The smell was horrid, and when I opened the windows, the cold winter air sent a sharp pain through the newly exposed flesh. That's the medical system for you. All of his fancy degrees, and the man had only managed to make the problem worse. I stopped at the drugstore to pick up more toothpaste, but as I walked around, I noticed looks from the other customers, and even some of the workers. They whispered and pointed in a way that probably meant to be discreet at the place on my arm where the gauze could not completely cover. Why couldn't people mind their own business? The smell wasn't that bad. I bought the toothpaste quickly, in such a hurry to be out of there that I didn't even wait for my change. The next Monday, I found that not even an entire tube of toothpaste would cover up the smell. Thanks to Dr. Murphy, the rest of the flesh had started to peel, and it had finally affected the mobility of my arm. I could barely twitch my fingers anymore. Worse, I think something might have gotten into it when I left it exposed on my way back to the office. Maybe even in the office. That place was horribly sterile. I couldn't be sure, but I swear I saw some white bits wiggling around it. I knew what I needed to do if I wanted to keep my job. The arm had to go. I called out sick. I know that doing it myself seems like a bad idea, but I hardly trust Dr. Murphy, and it's a fact that amputations aren't hard to perform, especially since I don't have any feeling in the arm. Think of all the people who've had their arms sawn off on battlefields. At least no one will be shooting at me while I do it. I told my boss I'd be out for a few days, and he didn't seem to mind very much. Hopefully he'll understand why it was worth it when I get back in. It really isn't that big of a deal. Well, that was fucked beyond comprehension. So, that was a video, I guess. Yeah, I'll be completely honest. I just kind of threw this video together, after, in a couple of days. I just thought of this idea. It was already past midnight on the 29th, and I was just like, you know what? Fuck it. So yeah, this is also my first kind of time making a video like that. This video required a lot more audio editing than anything else I've worked on. The only other thing that required anything close was, I guess, the Death Dash video. So, yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure there are a plethora of editing mistakes everywhere. But, yeah, this is just something neat that I wanted to throw together, for Halloween. So, yeah, happy Halloween, and, I'll see you all around, and remember, the best things happen in the dark. Can't even bring myself to actually say it. Points to anyone who gets that reference. Okay, but seriously, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and, happy Halloween, and, peace out.